Welcome to Hub Dialogues. I'm your host, Sean Speer, editor-at-large at The Hub. I'm honored to be back in conversation with award-winning journalist and best-selling author Amanda Lang for another installment of our bi-weekly video and podcast series on the key issues concerning Canadian business, economics, and public policy. In today's episode, our 14th this year, we'll look back on an eventful 2023 that started with the Bank of Canada's 8th interest rate hike in less than a year and ended with the sense that its rate hikes may finally be over. And of course, there was a lot that happened in the interim. We'll try to cover as much of it as we can as we look back a bit and look forward into 2024. Amanda, thanks as always for joining me.
Great to be with you.
I started with interest rate hikes, which took the Bank of Canada's benchmark rate to its highest level since 2021. Are rising interest rates the biggest economic story of the year in your mind?
I mean, I think there's certainly a close cousin. I would say affordability is the economic story of the year that I think that the Canadians would kind of agree was the big issue. And then the tentacles of affordability are so many and varied, including that, even as we go along here and macroeconomically things look pretty good. Economists can sit around and point to all the data that is working and it's all moving in the right direction. And yet we still, as you and I have talked about, have real humans saying, I don't feel good. And they don't feel good because prices haven't come down. They're still at this elevated level. And every time we go to the grocery store or the pump or anywhere, we're at this new higher level. And so affordability to me is the single biggest story. And it may well help shape what happens, of course, in the next year as well.
Another major story is that we managed to avoid a recession. Is that something that you would have predicted? And if not, how do you explain it?
I mean, I'm not sure I would have predicted one way or the other, but if I'm going to be called on things, I think we would say I probably would have thought we would have seen a more of a recession than we have seen, in the sense that we've seen an economic slowdown. We've seen just enough of an economic slowdown. I've been surprised. I don't know about you, but not just in Canada, but maybe especially the U.S., the extent to which that consumer is just continuing to spend and be willing to stay at the table. And that's going to make a big difference. It's certainly in that market making a huge difference. The thing, of course, that we're focused on now in Canada are some of these, again, does this go to how people really feel and what they're really going to do with their own pocketbooks? I don't know. But business investment has been abysmal, and that will catch up with us. There's really some important investment decisions businesses need to be making right now, especially on the technology front. We're not making them. That does come home to roost. And so all of that to me does point to the kind of slowdown we expected, that businesses are feeling a little less confident. And it did show up in the data. It sure does look at this moment, as you and I speak, as though Tiff Macklem and the Bank of Canada have managed to pull off that feat that looked so hard about a year ago, which was raise rates just enough to cool us down, not so much to cause a recession, get inflation under control, but avoid a bad economic downturn. But I'm one who says, do not celebrate early, because if you spike this ball early, you forfeit the game. I mean, there's just no question that we could mess this up still. And I'm super nervous about people saying rates are coming down, including Jerome Powell, the chair of the U.S. Federal Reserve. I wish he'd sit on his hands a little bit, because if we all act like rates are coming down, they're not coming down. It's just a kind of a self-fulfilling problem.
Yeah, as you say, Amanda, the difference between an economic slowdown and an actual recession, probably matters more for economists than it does for ordinary Canadians, especially since, as we discussed last time we spoke, the principal reason we didn't find ourselves in a recession is because of some revisions to for second quarter GDP estimates. The one thing I've been thinking a lot about since our last conversation, which I'd encourage people to check out, we talked about some of the issues we've already discussed here today, namely the growing divide between the macro numbers and what Canadians are telling us, either in confidence figures or even in the way that they are planning to spend over the holidays. The thing that I've been wondering about, though, is it would be super cool, Amanda, to see someone produce 2023 economic numbers accounting for normal trends with respect to immigration levels. Like, one wonders how much of the fact that we avoided a recession in 2023 is principally because the government of Canada has run an ahistorical immigration policy for the past 12 months, and in fact, for the past couple of years. Now, I'm not making a judgment about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing per se, at least as it relates to the GDP numbers. But it does speak to how manipulatable GDP figures can be, and why and may explain that gap between the numbers and people's sentiments.
I think that's right. Yeah. I mean, I definitely think, I mean, it's the per capita GDP that we started to pay attention to because, of course, it was declining. It does matter. We're still growing the overall economy, but everybody's share of it is shrinking. And of course, then you can get into that probably worthy conversation. And boy, I assume there are smart people doing this inside the hallways of government. I always assume there's a bunch of smart people having these conversations somewhere. Don't tell me I'm wrong, please, about how there's an investment period and that ultimately the payoff is the economy grows, and it grows on a per capita basis as well. In other words, immigration is good for everybody. It's good for the economy. History bears that out. Immigrants tend to be more productive. They tend to self-select and contribute. But there's a period of time when they have to adjust, right? They're not working immediately, and there may well be people who come with an immigrant who is working, who are not working and need to adapt. There's all kinds of factors. Ultimately, I think it's good, but I think you've actually hit on a point that if we're looking ahead into kind of what the political hotspots might be, and the place that I think we should pay attention as Canadians, we don't want to be drawn into a negative discourse around immigration. And that's not, you and I have talked about this, that does not mean we shouldn't have conversations. We can have, in the safety of our pro-immigrant status, which we have. Canadians have the bona fides. We are pro-immigrant. We believe in it. We're good at it. Inside that kind of zone, we can have conversations about how much is too much and what's the right amount. That's not anti-immigrant, and we shouldn't be afraid to have those chats.
Yeah, well said. It was something I was going to raise later in the conversation. But if I was stepping back and looking beyond issues like affordability, inflation, slow growth, and I had to say what I thought maybe the biggest political economy or political issue this year might be, I think I would put on the table emerging questions about immigration policy. For a long time, immigration policy almost seemed to be on something resembling autopilot. It just kept going up and up and up. And of course, there's a broad political consensus in favor of that direction. But you're starting to see, not merely in the fringes, Amanda, but a lot of people who look at the numbers, either at a macro level or a micro level, people on the ground who are supporting immigrants through the settlement and integration process, starting to raise questions about whether we're reaching a point of diminishing returns when we're approaching 500,000 per year in our permanent resident stream, and much higher than that when you account for non-permanent residents. Mikkel Skuterud, the University of Waterloo economist who we've been fortunate enough to have on Hub Dialogues a couple of times, has been doing some work, Amanda, on what he describes as almost the optimal level of annual intake. Because if you think about it this way, using the point system, which helps to ensure not just that people can make a good, useful contribution to the country, but also that they, as importantly, they themselves are well positioned to succeed in the country based on skills, language, etc. As the annual intake goes up, one of the consequences you risk just going lower in terms of scores with respect to the point system itself. So I think this question of what's the optimal level, and how do we make sure, as we've talked about so many times on this show, that we have the right infrastructure and supports and ways to ensure that people, when they get here, succeed. I think those questions started to emerge in a serious way in 2023 and probably will continue into 2024. What's your kind of thoughts or reaction to that?
I think you're totally right about that. I mean, it's really interesting again, like, I'm glad that people are looking at this from an almost academic point of view of optimal size, optimal intake rate. We have the data. Let's look at, that for a business, right? There's no point in growing your top line if you lose more money on every dollar. At some point, there's a sweet spot.
Yes.
And that's complicated. I would throw one other thing into the mix. And to me, it's important that as this becomes politicized, and that's what's happening, it's becoming a politicized issue, which means it will be abused, right? I want the conversations to be had now, again, in the context of, we tend to be pro-immigrant because there's not a soul in this country saving our indigenous peoples who are not that. So we tend to kind of have the mentality, we get it, we're on board. There's another, we can talk about housing, we can talk social services, we can talk about jobs. Let's not forget culture. And boy, have I ever touched the third rail there, right? Have I ever ventured into, but because we're a nation of almost an intellectual construct, we're an idea. We're on paper, right? We're our constitution, our Bill of Rights, I don't know what Canada is, but we better know what we are, because when you're growing the population by 1 million a year, you better have an understanding of what you're asking of people and what the trade-offs are. I throw that down there, saying that sentence, Sean, could be picked up and carried off in directions I would be horrified by. So I'm allowing for that. But I'm also saying, as a Canadian citizen who wants to continue to live in the country where we believe in rights and free speech and the values that we would hold, let's at least know what those values are. Let's at least know what we stand for. So however we have to do that. And so I would say to my fellow Canadians, let's throw down the gauntlet and say to politicians, don't make this ugly. If you make this ugly, that's not our values. So now we've definitely lost the plot, because what on earth are we asking people to sign on for if we've started out on the wrong foot? So I don't have the answer to it, but I would say I watch it. I think it's a worthwhile part of the conversation. It's a tricky one, but let's not shy away from it. The Canadians who believe in immigration, who want it, we do need to have a sense of, what does integration look like? And what do we mean by that? And what do we want from it? And I think we should be safe to do that.
You're just so thoughtful, Amanda. I would just say, bringing it back to business and economics, that if you talk to a lot of CEOs or Canadian business executives, they'll tell you that pluralism and tolerance are actually comparative advantages for Canada. It's not merely that it makes us feel good or that it's good for social cohesion nationally. They would argue it's actually good for Canada's economy. And pluralism and tolerance will only endure if we're prepared to confront some of those very issues and questions you raise. So I'm so glad that you did. I want to take up something you mentioned earlier, though. As we look into 2024, what's your sense about Canada's growth prospects? Even if we manage to avoid a recession, should listeners and viewers anticipate slow growth, including the possibility of negative growth in a quarter or two even?
Yeah, I think if that's in the cards, I think and it's worth remembering, of course, it's so easy to be distracted by that shiny economy to the south. Our growth is slower. We tend to be happy with 2.5%. That's not enough. That's just, especially if you're targeting inflation at 2%, you can do the math on that. So we do need to kind of figure out, and to me, actually, it's interesting. Some of the friends of the Hub, including people like Livio De Matteo, there is actually really good academic research on how important growth is. And if politicians and policymakers have one agenda, it should be growth, because it is, of course, the way to make everybody better off, to have more, to have abundance. And we are flawed in that respect. We're happy with slow growth. We accept it. Our businesses are complacent. We're probably anti-competitive in ways that inhibit growth. I'll throw back in, by the way, that folks who know about these things will tell you that a big source of entrepreneurship is immigrants. So that's one super big strength on the business side. But I think, we're going to head into this kind of malaise period unless, policies can change it, though. This is in our control. And I just hope that's the biggest focus for policymakers, because it makes everybody, of course, better off.
Yeah, well said. I think there's a tendency, especially in this century, with all of the claims about secular stagnation and so on, for there to be almost a sense of limited agency on the part of on the part of Canadians, business leaders or policymakers to change the direction. And as you say, we actually have a greater agency than we sometimes give ourselves credit for. What do you say to those who argue somewhat counterintuitively that a recession may actually be better for the economy to the extent that it reduces inflation pressures and sets the stage for earlier rate cuts?
I mean, I would say you're saying that if you think you're not the one whose business is going under or you're going to lose your job. It's, on paper, I suppose you could argue. I would say on paper, a big washout in housing might be a healthy thing. A big washout for the zombie businesses that litter our industrial landscape might be a good thing. But in practice, it's painful. And of course, people will go to great lengths to avoid it from a policy mechanism point of view. So I think just enough of a recession. This I'll go back to, why we shouldn't be saying rates are coming down and when, and because we don't want people planting that seed in their head and saying, okay, I only have to get to April. I'm just going to bridge over this period. I'm going to take on debt that I could pay off later. We're in a new normal. To your point, growth may be lower. Interest rates may reset just at this higher level. Let's say, 3.75 is where, just south of 4% is where that overnight rate is going to sit for years. I don't know if that's true, but let's just say that's a possibility. That's different for a lot of people and businesses. And I'd prefer people adjusted to that and then got a pleasant surprise to the upside if it went lower, rather than expecting some, gift in lower rates that's coming. So yeah, I mean, a recession at least keeps our minds focused. But we've had a lot of job layoffs, actually, quietly, right? People have lost their jobs, tens of thousands of Canadians, and the market is still, reasonably robust, but we're not talking about the tight market we were at the start of this year. That's been a big shift.
In preparation for our conversation today, Amanda, I went back and checked out our 13 previous episodes. I mean, we covered a lot of stuff this year. Some of the topics we've already talked about: inflation, affordability, housing, growth, immigration. We also spent a lot of time talking about competition, climate change, the list goes on and on. Why don't you just talk a bit about some of the other issues in your mind that define 2023 from a business or economics point of view?
I mean, I think one of the biggest is the one that you actually identified and highlighted, which is the disconnect between how individuals are experiencing the economy and how kind of policymakers are feeling about the economy. And there's a couple of places that has showed up for me. Markets, of course, can be, markets like stock markets can be disconnected from what feel like the kind of real economic events of the day. One example of that, of course, would be, one of the big stories of the year was Sam Bankman-Fried and FTX, his crypto exchange going down, huge fraud. Maybe a highlight for people that this is a murky part of the market, buyer beware. And yet, within a month, Bitcoin, which is, sort of the bizarrest of all of the ways to play in that market, is hitting not quite all-time highs, but heading back up to levels where people are still believers. I do feel as though we've kind of skated by some, a couple of small US banks failed in the spring.
Yes.
And it was a reminder that even the smartest people who manage our money don't realize that situations can change and they should prepare for that. And yet we've kind of skated past that and we're on the other side of it. I guess memories are short, and I wish people would, all of us would just remember that these things happen, they can happen again, and just to kind of factor it in a little bit more than we are. We seem so willing to just kind of skate past it as though it never happened.
Yeah, you're talking about disconnects there, Amanda. Strikes me that one of the biggest disconnects in 2023 is between Canadian businesses and policymakers, between the Trudeau government's activist policies and Pierre Poilievre's populism, and including his refusal to meet with CEOs. It does feel like the relationship between the two, that is business and government, has become wider than it has in a long time. Is that your sense too? And what do you think the consequences are?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned Pierre Poilievre. I mean, he's unashamedly saying he doesn't want to meet. He told the Bay Street crowd, "I don't like to be seen with you folks." Which to me was shocking, because there has been that disconnect, but that a politician actually feels it's expedient to say so. In other words, now we've got to the point where you want to be seen to be anti-business, not just be quietly anti-business. is an unpleasant new chapter. And one of the things we have going on in this country that's terrible is when we are all anti-business, which we tend to be, we tend to think business is bad, fewer people want to do it. So we have a decline in entrepreneurs. We make our big successful companies feel like culprits. They've done something wrong. The more money they have, the more they must have done something. They've gotten up to something bad. Now, to be fair, some of them are in industries that are protected and have not enough competition, but that's not their fault. They're living in the regulatory environment we've handed them, and then they're doing what they're supposed to do. That anti-business mentality slows us all down. It keeps our kids from wanting to go into business. It makes it harder for them to get money. It makes them harder for them to feel good about what they're doing. So for politicians, I mean, you and I have talked about this before. It's been true for a long time that politicians can be sort of a little bit wary, and they're not quite as close as you might think they should be. For them to openly say, I don't want to be seen with you folks, is a shocking stage of this problem. And we have to reverse it. I would vote for a politician who stood up and said, if you're out there starting a business, it's profitable, you employ people, you're my hero. That's what else, that's what a politician is here to do. Back to the growth story. Governments don't grow things. They just don't. Governments can facilitate, but businesses grow things. And that's what, if you want to make a bigger economy, you need businesses to do it. So I don't know what you think if you were back in the policy chair, how you would fix this, but I do feel like this is an alarming trend.
Yeah, I agree. And as you say, this hasn't happened overnight. It's been an evolution. But it does feel like in 2023, it's gone to a new level where we have politicians using the bully pulpit to essentially extract different actions or choices out of business under the threat of regulation on one hand, and on the other hand, as you say, our center-right party, the party that's in theory more predisposed to markets, essentially either saying it won't meet business, or in some cases actually, shifting to the left of the government on certain things. For instance, Pierre Poilievre was quick earlier this year to call on the Trudeau government to block a corporate transaction involving Teck, the resource company based in Vancouver. So there is something funny going on. I tend to think that politicians follow the public. They don't necessarily lead the public. And so they're discerning that this anti-business sentiment permeates the Canadian population, or at least the voters that they're trying to ultimately attract. But I think there is something kind of inherently unhealthy about it. And it needs some adjustment. I mean, it's fair to say, Amanda, that the coziness between business and government, say in the 1980s or something, that probably needed some correction. But it does feel like in the past several years, we've kind of overcorrected. And not only, I think, is that bad for the culture, as you talked about, I think it's bad for the bottom line, too, if we have businesses increasingly making judgments not motivated by return on investment or profits, but by how they interpret politicians might react in Ottawa. I mean, that is a bad recipe for our economy.
I agree. I mean, I think we need a bit of a reframing. Maybe this is all part of an evolution. It's interesting when you say politicians follow, they don't lead. And you know more about that than I do. Boy, I wish it was the opposite. I mean, I do wish we could. And I'm nostalgic for the past. Maybe that's just the way it is. But I feel as though we have had leaders in this country who were willing to say what were seen to be unpopular things and persuade a populace that there was a good argument there. And to me, that is one of the reasons to be in public office. And if you're there, please use your pulpit wisely. You shouldn't just be putting a wet finger to the wind. I really wish people would think about where we're going, because these are some big issues, and the general population doesn't always know the right answer.
I have to ask you, in addition to the various topics we've been discussing, are there any sleeper issues? Are there any ones that you think, in hindsight, the two of us missed in these conversations?
I don't know that we I don't know that there were. I mean, feel like this year was actually kind of an obvious year for the big stories. I do feel like affordability was this kind of the single biggest story for Canadians. And as I said, I think it'll continue to be. Um, I I really feel like this conversation would be incomplete if we didn't mention Taylor Swift somewhere. But that's really the only issue I would say took some of us by surprise. The success of that artist and that tour, which continues. But no, I think the other issues we covered them and they were clear, and that's a good thing. Actually, I don't think there were. And I don't. What do you think? There's anything that we should have spent more time on? Because to me, actually, you were the one who really underscored last time we talked that how people feel versus how they're being told to feel, and the gap between those two things. That's a big, to me, that is the story, and that may well define what happens in 2024 as well.
Yeah, I think that's right. Unintentionally, Amanda, one theme in this conversation has proven to be the idea of disconnects or growing gaps between how people feel and the broader economic narrative, the relationship between business and government, and so on. Another that I've been thinking about in recent weeks, and in a way was reflected in my question, is the possible disconnect between those working in the private sector and those working in the public sector, and where I think that may come to a head as we move into 2024 is with respect to work from home policy. That you're in Toronto, you're much closer to Bay Street than I am, but my sense is that the private sector is increasingly kind of moving in a direction when it comes to workplace arrangements that more closely resembles pre-pandemic experience than the immediate post-pandemic experience. And if that hypothesis or if that interpretation is right, it is not being reflected in the public sector, where I was in Ottawa last month. The practice of work from home remains prevalent across the federal government for sure. And so one wonders if these different workplace arrangements between those working in business and those working in government may be a story as we close out 2023 that really kind of rises to the fore of labor relations in 2024.
I would add to that. I think you're right, that public-private sector divide. Let's add wages to the mix too, because the really big wage gains have been union-driven. So that does capture some private sector employees for sure, auto workers included. But a lot of public sector workers will see wage gains that I wonder what we've seen in the private sector side. Catch up. So 4.5%, certainly better than we've seen in the past. But we may well see a big adjustment in that if we see inflation coming down. That may be it for a lot of people, whereas union wage contracts are multi-year and they're locked in for the next 3 years of increases. That could be a big divide we see ahead as well.
You mentioned Taylor Swift. I'd be remiss if I didn't ask about Elon Musk. What are we to make of his 2023 and his place, not just in our economic life these days, but increasingly in our cultural and political life?
Well, actually, I would offer up that Elon Musk is the antithesis of Taylor Swift in every single way. I think Elon Musk is a fascinating force, one that history will judge just how malevolent a force he is. There's some evidence that not everything he does is going to be good for the broader public. It certainly hasn't been particularly good for the business called X now. As we've seen, there's been a real damage to the brand and to ad revenues. And yet, this is the man who popularized the electric vehicle in a way that wasn't happening at any kind of speed. We give him his due. He may be a genius. I'm just not persuaded he's a force for good in the world. And X is really, as unimportant as it is in some ways, it is, of course, hugely important in how people perceive one another and share ideas. And that's been, I think that's done some damage socially, if I can put it that way.
No, it's been a tumultuous tenure as the owner of the company. A company, I would just say, for better or for worse, I think will loom even larger in 2024 as we head into a U.S. presidential cycle that I think will play out in a lot of ways on social media in an unprecedented way, if one can even believe that. Which maybe is a good way to wrap up our conversation today. What do you look ahead for in 2024?
Well, if I'm optimistic, then as Amal wants us to be, your producer, so I will be. I think we may well see the backside of inflation and recession fear. So while I don't want people to rush this fence, we should be able to get to inflation that is closer to where the central bank wants it, rates that can settle in somewhere where we can have solid expectations, and then be able to focus on how to grow the economy in a way that doesn't risk, undoing that good work. But I think that's a back half of 2024 story. I think that's a second, third quarter, maybe even fourth quarter story. I don't think that's the new year. I think we're still in this fight. It's not over yet, and we should not rush through it.
Yeah, I would echo those views. And I think we're, maybe for my reaction to what you said, and as we look ahead to 2024, I get the sense that we're going to see a bit of unreliable policymaking in our politics. We have a government in Ottawa that finds itself in a difficult political position. I think the Ontario government similarly finds itself in a tough political spot, kind of marred by scandal, a new, seemingly attractive alternative for the first time in a long time in a Liberal Party leader. I think as these governments face these political challenges, we're going to see policymaking not necessarily rooted in the evidence, as you like to see, Amanda, but throwing a lot of things against the wall. I think that will have consequences in terms of spending and the likelihood that we see larger as opposed to smaller deficits, and probably some negative trends in terms of that business government relationship that we were talking about, as politicians look to score cheap points in the short term and maybe at the expense of the long term. So I suppose that's my glasses half empty take on your glasses half full take, which is why it's so good to be able to be with you. I just want to thank you personally for all of these conversations over 2024 or 2023 rather. I learned a ton. You have such a great mind and perspective and set of experiences and insights. So thank you so much. And I look forward to doing this again early in the new year. Happy holidays to you and happy holidays. And thank you so much to our listeners and viewers. It's been a great year and look forward to taking this back up early in the new one.
Thanks so much, Sean. I love talking to you. And thanks to everybody who's with us for all of this. It's a great pleasure.